Hello students, today we will go to the 8th part of our styles and movements and we will be talking about critical regionalism. Critical regionalism is very different from the other styles and movements that we have talked about. Of course, we have seen terrific differences when we talked about deconstructivism the last time. Deconstructivism is closer to my heart because India has probably the largest, critical regionalism is closest to my heart because India has the largest bank of critical regional buildings or CR buildings in the world, and I will tell you some of the reasons why that is so. What is critical regionalism? Why are we talking about it? By the late 1960s and early 70s, there was a realization about the limitations of modernism, and it was considered that it was placeless, it lacked regional identity, socio-cultural and regional aspirations of people were not being considered. Now, we have already seen that in some way when we talked about the rise of postmodernism, because late modernism was a continuity of modernism, intensification of modernism, whereas deconstructivism, postmodernism, they completely moved away or rather they moved away from modernism. But keep this in mind that modernism continued to remain the basis of postmodernism as well as deconstructivism. I have clearly mentioned that in my presentations about that, and so in a similar manner in critical regionalism also, which we will see, modernism continues to remain in its foundation. Now, when we look at the international style and modernism in India and the world, this is an example of few of the buildings of the modernist period, whether it is Nightly Habitation or the IIT Delhi building or the WHU building by Habib Rahman or the Bauhaus in Germany or this building. All these buildings seem very similar to each other. The modernist tall building, it is a homogeneous built environment, not responsive to regional context. If we have the Seagram building in New York, we have the Air India building by Johnson Burgee in Mumbai, and we find essentially, or even the Trident Hotel, and we find that they are just cuboidal masses varying from America to India just because we didn't use glass because of our climate, we used RCC, they use steel and glass, but basically these buildings are very similar to each other and not responsive to regional contexts. So this picture really clarifies the issue. If you have joined in my earlier presentation on modern Indian architecture, you will be able to recollect some of the slides that I will be showing you today, because I will be recapitulating the contribution of India as the paramount contribution to critical regionalism. So our focus in CR is more India than any other country. Here in this slide what you see is, this was earlier when we talked about houses or buildings in Asia, Russia, Europe, South America, each one had a different flavor. But now that identity has been lost in all over the world. We have created the same kind of buildings, disconnecting people and users from their local regional built environment. There is a placeless, rootless identity as you see in this picture. Normally glass and steel buildings all over the world. This is the modern uniformity of cities. If you can just make out one building probably which is iconic, so you can connect to that city. So for example, you can see this pinnacle here and you know that you are looking at New York. You can look at this building, for example here, the Bank of China, and know this is a night view of Hong Kong. You look at this Commerce Bank here and you connect with this city, this is Frankfurt. But what about this? Yeah, again in the Petronas Tower, you can connect it to Kuala Lumpur, and this, my friends, is Mumbai. But if this kind of identification was not there, it will be very difficult for us to make out which city is which. So identical they have become, the regional flavor, the regional taste is gone. In late modern tall buildings, not just in modern tall buildings, in late modern tall buildings, they all speak the same language and continue the rootless global identity. In postmodernism, with all their playfulness and ornamentation and historical context, they are the impulsive individualism and ornamentation of postmodernism also gets rejected. So Indian architects started moving away from the direct influence of the masters like Le Corbusier and Louis Kahn and Walter Gropius, and begun climatically and culturally appropriate designs for Indian problems. Like in this slide you see the Gandhi Smarak Sangralaya with Charles Correa. The issues of climate, heat and dust, winter chill, social context became increasingly important in designing the buildings in India. Buildings that were made earlier based on, say, the Bauhaus, whether it was the Atira office building by A.P. Kanvinde or other buildings by Habib Rahman, borrowing from the Bauhaus idea, or other such buildings like Shivnath Prasad's Akbar Hotel designed on the model of United Habitation, or other buildings, they were just extensions of the modernist idea, and they were not different from them. They were not reflecting our regional identity. But these buildings started doing that. Also important was, while erecting these buildings, they had to be done quickly within a tight budget in the 1960s, 70s or 80s. So critical regionalism is a progressive approach to design where it merges global and local language of architecture. What is critical regionalism? The right balance of the rational approach of modernism along with the architectural traditions of a particular region, merging them together. The variant of modern architecture which has greater respect towards climate, topography, local materials and the socio-cultural context of the place. The term critical regionalism first appeared in the architectural discourse in essays given by Alexander Tzonis and Liane Lefaivre, and then finally the term was made globally popular by Kenneth Frampton. So today if you would generally ask who coined the term critical regionalism, normally the response would be Kenneth Frampton in 1983. From a global perspective in critical regionalism, let's hear what Kenneth Frampton has to say. He says, critical regionalism should aim to mediate the impact of universal civilization with elements derived indirectly from the peculiarities of a particular place. Here universal civilization refers to the homogenizing influence of global modernism. That global modernism has homogenize the building, taking away all the local context, the steel and glass towers, the international style. That's universal civilization that has to be mediated with what? With the elements that we get indirectly from a particular place. The particular place means a unique climate, culture, materials and social habits of the people. So we derive from that and incorporate that or mediate the universal civilization model with that. And the aim is not a nostalgic return back to vernacular style, but a mediated architecture, a very well thought out critiqued architecture which is modern in its tools and technologies, but it is place specific in its expression. So when we look at a building like that, it is modern, but it is a modern Indian building. If you look at a building by Luis Barragan in Mexico, it is a modern Mexican building. A Tadao Ando, a modern Japanese building. An Arvar Alto, a modern Finnish building. They are definitely modern, but one more key word has been added, the location of the building. So here modern building, it is a modern building, say for example the Kanchenjunga by Charles Correa, but it provides a sense of place and meaning. Kanchenjunga for that matter is specifically designed for the climate or the weather of Mumbai. Not only that, the very site on which it has been placed, how it takes the breeze in, how it gets the views of the Arabian Sea, all of that is there in this building. Therefore, I am drawing the comparison with the Seagram to show you that this building has got place and meaning. So critical region seeks to balance local aspects with the progressive lessons of modernism. For example, this British consulate housing that was done by Raj Rewal, if you look at this, you are reminded of Rajasthani architecture. There are chhatris, he has notionally provided or symbolically provided the kind of spaces, the courtyards etc. that is done. You are reminded of Rajasthani architecture, but the building also reminds you of modern architecture or modernist architecture. In its planning, it reminds you of modernist planning like that of the Schrader House. So it is critical regionalism. It is taking a universal civilization and it is mediating that with the elements of a particular place. Its aim is to counter the homogeneity of modernist architecture, as you see here, this homogeneity in all these houses. So, the reasons why India became the place where there are likely the most works of critical regionalism, likely India has those most works because of enormous climate and cultural diversity. From Himalayas to deserts to the coastal regions, the variety of vernacular traditions across the regions of India, there are so many. The post-colonial search for identity by architects like Charles Correa, B.V. Doshi, etc., who sought a modern identity for an India, for the Indian ethos. The resource constraints and the climate necessity, because we needed to build passively, because we did not have enough resources, we were not economically strong, our building technology was not that fine, so we needed to rely on making buildings climatically responsive. Passive design, local materials, adaptive reuse was necessary for economic and climatic reasons, and the continued practice across generations also helped us. Generation after generation, architects have carried on the CR model, from masters like Charles Correa, B.V. Doshi and Raj Rewal to the contemporary architects like Bijoy Jain, Samim Padora, Sanjay Puri, Morphogenesis, etc. But let us just step back a bit and look at the term modern regionalism or regional modernism. This actually was coined by a female architect from Sri Lanka. Her name was Minnette de Silva. And Minnette de Silva understood the limitations of modernism in an Asian regional context. Best from both modern and traditional architecture was needed. She understood that, and thus came the Pieris house, whose pictures you see here, which has an open courtyard, what is called in Sri Lanka, it is a part of their architectural heritage, so to speak, a space called the Meda Medulla. This Meda Medulla has been created in this living area. Thus, this whole idea of wedding the regional context, the Meda Medulla of Sri Lanka with modern architecture. And though Minnette de Silva coined the term modern regionalism, call it regional modernism, but it was then further refined by another Sri Lankan architect, Geoffrey Bawa. And in Geoffrey Bawa's work we find tropical modernism akin to same regional modernism. Whether it was the parliament building that he designed or the other buildings done by him, he brought in this concept of tropical modernism. Critical regionalism has then spread all over the world because everyone wants to follow what Kenneth Frampton said, to mediate the universal civilization with elements of that particular region. Thus we have Glenn Burkett in Australia, we have architects in Israel, we have architects in Japan, we have architects like Raj Rewal in India, or we have architects like Louis Barragan in Mexico. Critical regionalism or regional modernism, please bear with me for some time until I clarify this. Even before Indian architects were aware of this term, they were still subconsciously pursuing the idea in their building design. For example, in the India International Center by Joseph Allenstein, I have studied that in detail in my series Modern Indian Architecture, so I won't go there, but whether it was to siting of buildings, light and shade, use of local materials or materials, construction process, climate responsive features, traditional elements used in a modern context, all this we find in IIC that you see here and in other buildings. Now, not only them, we can go even further back. Similar ideas we see in the work of Edwin Lutyens, who gave us New Delhi along with Herbert Baker, and even Lutyens was conscious of orientation, shading and natural cooling. In fact, every architect of any bearing who came to India always understood one thing: you cannot build against the climate, you have to build with the climate, and they also did that. So even if the building is colonial, it is still being modified to suit the climate of India. And other features have also been taken. For example, we not go there, but the Sanchi Stupa is clearly evident in the dome of the Rashtrapati Bhavan. And then also the use of these climate responsive features in the Delhi's bungalow zone. Similar ideas we also find in the works of Corbusier and Levi, who also responded to the context and thus brought in shading, passive ventilation, appropriate use of materials and landscape, whether it was in the IIM Ahmedabad or in the Sarabhai house in Ahmedabad. But the generation that followed or even worked with them was a truly modern regional architectural language brought in by them. They brought that language, and they were architects like B.V. Doshi, Charles Correa, Rahul Mehrotra, Bimal Patel, etc. And thus critical regionalism took its roots in India, like in the Sangath by B.V. Doshi, or like the new campus of IIM Ahmedabad by Bimal Patel. Now, just coming back to that one point I made, that I will discuss it, and I am discussing it here, the difference between critical regionalism and regional modernism. They do overlap, there is no doubt about it. Often somebody might just say critical regional modernism. What is the difference? Critical regionalism is deeper. It is more thoughtful evolution of regional modernism. CR doesn't just adapt to modernism, but it questions it. It roots it in the place, the culture and the experience. So it is a much more thoughtful, much more worked out regionalism, that is critical regionalism. For example, here we have the Trenton Baths designed by Louis Kahn, an example of that, the plan of that, and along with that, this vernacular cluster from one of the areas of India, regions of India, the vernacular cluster of the dwellings. And they have been put together in a new form, the Gandhi Samarak Sangrahalaya, which is basically a village, a cluster of huts that are connected together, and the form of each of these huts, so to speak, is similar to the Trenton Baths. So you take from the modern, you take from the vernacular, and you merge them together into a building which is critical regionalism. Or even in the form itself, you take from the Trenton Baths, you take the vernacular hut and you merge them together in the Gandhi Samarak Sangrahalaya, which has got Mangalore tiles and a pyramidal Mangalore tiled roof over a very simple brick columns and a concrete beam grid. The influence of critical regionalism varied with political, economic and social changes. For example, after India's liberalization in the 1990s, a global architectural style of glass curtain walls and plastic finishes became dominant. And you see, when you look at Gurugram, for example, you see all glass and steel in this fast evolving city, particularly after the 1990s. And you find, just like the earlier picture of the various cities of the world, you find that modern uniformity in India also. If you take these 4 cities of India, you find that uniformity. But though this uniformity came in because of liberalization, because glass and steel came in abundantly in India, new technologies came in faster because our economy really leapfrogged forward, but it did not take away the inclination of architects working under CR. These architects were even more greater inclined to make critical regional buildings. So there is a comparison. Post liberalization, on one hand we have glass, steel and RCC buildings like this, and versus critical regionalism buildings like the India Habitat Center and the EIL building by Raj Rewal. IHC was by Joseph Allenstein. What is the impact of the global style? Reliance on technology to light and air condition our buildings and cars to reach them is the modern life. Very high energy consumption corresponding to very high carbon emissions, creating an unpleasant urban environment with great disparity between the haves and the have-nots. Therefore, the aim to be sophisticated and modern is actually being rejected by the West. This is what our city is. Look at this city, this is the picture of Mumbai, and look at the difference between the haves and the have-nots. Look at the disparity, or look at even today's cities with the high amount of pollution, the high amount of carbon emission. Thus the answer lies in critical regionalism, a different approach from the homogeneous or global architecture by relating architecture to the place. How does it then deal with the problem of carbon emissions? I will come to that in a little while. Let's look at a few other things like placelessness versus context. Placelessness of the modern architecture versus the context that arises because of critical regional architecture, a sense of place and meaning. Sensitive to local climate and technological constraints of the local building industry in critical regionalism. If we look at several aspects of CR, they are historical context, climate responsiveness, local material construction, ecological sensitiveness, cultural appropriateness, technological sustainability. Historical context, again going back to that housing I was showing you of Raj Rewal, it takes into account the building traditions of the region, that is Rajasthan in this case, because this project was in Delhi, but only in a sense, not a literal reference. He has not simply made the Haveli again. He has taken the essence of the Haveli, the essence of the architecture or the Chhatris for example, and then brought that essence into this housing. The historical context you find in Andrewsganj housing by S.K. Das 2001, where when we find in our older towns, traditional towns, this kind of mutual shading impact over the streets because of these cantilevers, so we find the same approach taken in this housing. Or even in this housing by Charles Correa, he takes this mutual shading effect of Jaisalmer and brings that into the Tara group housing in Delhi. So comes the dictum coined by Charles Correa, that is true for India, rather than the modernist form follows function, the dictum becomes form follows climate. The reason for climate responsive architecture today, earlier there was a problem of lack of technology, unaffordability of centrally conditioned buildings. We were constrained to design as per climate because we couldn't afford air conditioning. The advantage was that architects were focused on the built form. They want to have innovative design solutions so as to provide indoor thermal comfort through passive means by using the climate in favor of the building. The use of tried and tested lessons from traditional or vernacular architecture of a region came into use at that time. Thus, we responded to the climatic conditions of the site, how to benefit from the solar radiation, how to minimize dependence on mechanical means like air conditioning and artificial lighting. In the Sangath building for example, the studios made by the architect have been sunk in, they are subterranean, and there are these external walls which are 1 meter thick, hollowed out so that you can make storage niches from the inside. So they are not only insulative but they also lead to space efficiency. Then how to reduce the internal heat gain through the vaults. What they have done is they have taken these cylindrical terracotta tiles that you see here, cut them in half and or rather use the cylindrical tiles and put them in between two layers of ferrocement shells like this. They have put these cylindrical terracotta tiles like this, and they have covered this with white ceramic pieces or mosaic, and as a result of that, this white ceramic tile reflects the heat back. Whatever solar radiation is going to go in, because of the hollow terracotta tiles, an air gap is created and that is also avoided, and thus indoor thermal comfort increases because of that. Heat gain is much less. This whole idea of using mosaic tiles comes from Tancredis, the idea of Antoni Gaudi. Daylighting also comes inside the building to avoid artificial lighting. It comes from the top window on the skylight. It comes the skylight here. It comes from the normal windows that are punched in the wall. So it comes from the skylight, normal windows punched in the wall, and here you see these glass bricks over which water flows, but it also allows light to come down into the spaces below. But the reason why we want climate responsive architecture today is different. Then it was because we were economically weak, air conditioning was not an option, we had to use passive strategies to cool our buildings and reduce and increase endothermal comfort. But today, when the economy got liberalized post 1990s, we have the resources, we can condition our buildings, we have the materials, but there is a serious global problem of carbon emissions. 38% of global carbon emissions happen from buildings, out of which 28% is in operating the building. Therefore, it is very, very imperative to make energy efficient, low carbon buildings. And one of the ways in which we do that is by making our buildings in the same model again as past, make climate responsive, passive buildings, green, sustainable buildings. And that we do when we use critical regionalism. That is one of the ways to do that. Therefore, the use of climate responsive buildings, solar passive architecture is needed, and we also get economic benefits, because when we save operating energy, we save money. Thus, in all these projects you see here, critical regionalism is the way to go. Now, the design of energy efficient and green buildings today, they can be highly engineered, hermetically sealed to achieve high energy efficiency, and can have no impact of the external climate. It is possible to do an energy efficient building like this, but the use of climate responsive solar passive techniques are done by many architects of the earlier times and today. And the third method is a hybrid, where both advanced techniques and solar passive means are applied together. So, in the Cisco building in Bangalore, we look at the first one, very highly engineered, hermetically sealed, energy efficient building. The second type, critical regionalism, we see in the house by Shirish Berry, and the third type, where there is a mix of two, there is technology and there is also use of passive means, we find that in the IGBC building by Karan Grover in Hyderabad. Now, earlier techniques were applied based on empirical or observational data, but now we can design energy efficient buildings based on accurate prediction right from the design stage, and we can simulate, model the buildings, we have the tools and techniques to do that, and we can make them energy efficient, and with reference to codes like Griha, LEED or ECBC. So, we today can make a building like this climate responsive, which is the KMC corporate office in Hyderabad by RMA Associates, Rahul Mehrotra Associates, which has a green wall, or we can use local materials in construction. I am taking you way back to the 1970s. This is a project by UC Jain of the Jodhpur University using yellow sandstone with local methods of construction, and modernist principles have been used for spatial organization, and they have used the local materials like the stone beam here. Because they have used the beam as it is, they cannot increase the width of the corridor, it is controlled by the width of the available beam. So, the structure and form is according to the fundamental order of load bearing construction. So, the spans are shorter, the stone pergola screens the central node, but then it leads to these theatres, these 4 lecture theatres, which are modern design theatres, and thus we have vernacular construction technique with modern planning of lecture theatres. The mass and profile is classic desert architecture. This flight of stone steps that you see is directly evoking the kind of construction within the city, the old town, and to counter the hot desert climate here, he has provided these double walls. What you see here is that in front of the fenestration is a small wall here that prevents the sun from directly impacting the window, keeping it away, and thus increases the indoor thermal comfort. Brise Soleil has been fantastically used by UC Jain by not attaching them to the building as Corbusier would do, but keeping it away from the building so that you get maximum shadow effect of the Brise Soleil on the building facade and be able to, and thus he has adapted it for the hot and dry climate of Rajasthan. Now, when we come to ecological sensitiveness, we talk about the minimum impact on ecology caused by a building like the Bharat Bhavan in Bhopal by Charles Correa, who goes with the flow of the sloped landscape and builds the Bharat Bhavan according to that, flowing towards the river and creating subterranean structure. The art center is designed as a sunken courtyard with a series of terraced gardens. This is a revival of traditional Indian architecture. Hillside gently slopes towards the lake and provides these terraces, courtyards and amphitheatres. There is lighting and ventilation within the building through these stoplights, and these stoplights are used by him in other buildings also, like in the Silvakau church in Mumbai. We find that here in Bharat Bhavan he does it in the church with this tinted glass and brings the light deep inside. Then there is cultural appropriateness, another aspect of critical regionalism. The building responds to the way of life of the building users. This is the building in Jaipur, the Jawahar Kala Kendra, and in this building, the Bharat Bhavan, he revives traditional Indian architecture, synthesizes modern and historical principles, relies on the Vastu Purusha Mandala for the design of the of the Vidhan Bhavan, and the major hall in Central Square, instead of being an open space as it should be, the Shunya Bindu, here he takes artistic license and actually makes it a hall, and the hall itself is having the dome of the Sanchi, the dome is like that of the Sanchi Stupa. Thus, we find a similar license in the Jawahar Kala Kendra, which is again based on the Vastu Purusha Mandala, but here in the case of the mandala, he moves one square away in Jaipur, very similar to the plan of Jaipur. In Jaipur, the northeast square that was there was taken out and put on the southeast. But in this case, only the southeast square has been displaced, and that is it. So, here he not only does this, but he relates the plan of Jawahar Kala Kendra with the plan of the city of Jaipur, where the Kala Kendra is. Technological sustainability we find in many buildings, we find in the works of Raj Rewal, we find it in the works of morphogenesis to benefit the building programs. Now, the complexity for a modern Indian architecture is immense. There is enormous regional, climatic and geographical, cultural variations, fundamental differences in building materials and methods of construction, design approaches. Many building types are needed, from economically weaker section housing to modern industrial plants, and it is not feasible to have an architecture applicable for the whole of India. For example, the enormous regional, climatic, geographical, cultural variations throughout our nation. Even just look at the regional geographical variations, from the mountains to the plains to the rivers to the desert all over our country. Look at the cultural variations, the variations in our food throughout our country. Look at the building material, method of construction and design approaches in Himachal, in Kerala, in Rajasthan, in West Bengal and other places. Or look at the tremendous type of buildings we need, from 5-star hotels to housing for the poor to hospitals, etc. Thus, we have iconic works who have where there is materials, there is climate, there is socio-cultural context merged with modernism. So, another aspect comes in front of us, which is the neo-traditional style. I will stop here and we will pick up from here in the next session, where I will begin by talking to you about the aspect of neo-traditional style and its relation with critical regionalism, its various aspects, and we will look at the works of other international architects along with Indian architects. I will again repeat, the reason why I began with India is because in all likelihood, maximum works of critical regionalism lie in India because of its amazing diversity. So, we began with India, but I will take you to other global works in the next presentation when we will conclude critical regionalism. Thank you.